Every warrior has a story. Throughout American history, regular citizens have been called on to become warriors. They leave their civilian lives, train, and fight. The lucky ones return home, blending back into American society, neither telling nor being prompted for their stories of dedication, courage, tragedy, and triumph. Their stories can languish, sometimes for decades. Until now. This is the story of U.S. Army Air Force First Lieutenant Bert A. Jr., who in World War II transformed from a quiet civilian life in San Diego, California, to being a B-24 bomber pilot flying 30 combat missions out of England over enemy-occupied Europe. This is his warrior story, told in his words.
I graduated from high school, Hoover High School in San Diego, in February of 1941. Went to work till September because I didn't want to start a college course in midterm. And I was in college at San Diego State College, and all of a sudden, December 7th, when war broke out, I decided I would finish that one semester of college, which I did, and then I went down to enlist in the Air Force. They told me I had a double hernia, which I had no idea that I had. Said it was probably, it was with me since birth. So I had that taken care of and operated on. Then went back a few months later and to re-enlist, or to enlist, try to enlist again, and I did fine, except my eyes didn't pass. So anyway, I drank carrot juice for a couple of weeks and went back and got in the Air Force. Then by then they were having so many people applying that I didn't get immediately called. I got enlisted in July of '42. But it was October or November before I was called to active duty. Then I went to Santa Ana Army Air Base, and that was an interesting few months. We were aviation cadets at that point, and the days started generally around 5 o'clock and went till after dark. We had high altitude chambers that we took tests in effect, to show us how long you could live without oxygen. And we had gas mask training, which was fun. Not really. And we did have off on weekends after first month or so. So I could, by leaving on Saturday after we got out, this was a month or two after I got to Santa Ana, I was able to go back to San Diego by hitchhiking. I was very fortunate to stay near my home area. They trained all over the United States, but mine, I got into the Western Training Command, and once you start in the training command, you stay in that command. So I was lucky to be in the Western one. We had a little bit of relief at Santa Ana on weekends. We had to be back Sunday before noon because they always had a parade in Santa Ana at Sunday afternoon. At Santa Ana, we had both physical training and mental training, I guess you could call it. We had courses to take, and then in addition, the main thing was to classify us as pilots, bombardiers, or navigator to go to the training. And we'd do the usual psychological tests that went on for weeks. And the physical part was very strenuous, and the usual running and push-ups, etc. So I was there 2-3 months. The whole part of the base that I on came down with measles, including me, but I didn't show mine. They were hidden in the hair. So as we were transferring out, we got orders to go then to different places. I was to go to Hemet for primary training. So I got out by going on the bus or probably a bus. And we got into Hemet and they checked everybody for measles and they still didn't find my measles. So about 2 days later, before I'd done any flying, they found them and they sent me off to the hospital at Marshfield, Riverside. So I was gone a couple, 2 to 3 weeks. All the rest of the group that I was in, which was Class 43I, all the rest of that group, except those few of us who went to Marshfield with the measles, had probably come close to soloing by this time. They had in a few hours of flying. They all had their instructors and this sort of thing. When I got there, I got as an instructor a Czech pilot who wasn't too busy with the others at this point. They weren't far enough along. So I got him for a few hours. Then I got somebody else, and then somebody else, then somebody else. Then I got one that was really good, and he went out on a motorcycle 2 or 3 days later and got in an accident. So I didn't have him anymore. So I had problems learning to fly. At Ryan, we flew PT-22s, which was one of the earliest low-wing monoplanes that they had as a trainer. Prior to that, they'd used the biplanes. And I finally got around to where I was taking I passed my 10-hour test, soloed, got around to the 30-hour test, and I flunked that outright, went back up and did much more air work by myself in the solo, and did that, took it again, flunked it again. So you can see that the training with different people, they all wanted things a little bit differently. So I did it again, and I didn't have any luck then either. I finally passed my 30-hour test at the 45 to 50 hours. And that was because I flew with one of the squadron commanders. He told me what he wanted, and I went up and practiced it for 2 or 3 days. Came down and rode with him for the exam, and did it the way he wanted it, and I passed. So I was on my way. Then I continued to fly at Ryan until I got 50, 60 hours, 70 hours. And I took another 60-hour test or whatever it was, and then everybody had to ride with a military officer before they left, take a check ride. So I did that, passed that, and no problems. So primary was the place where most of the cadets that were going to wash out did it in primary. I went to basic, and obviously I was not a strong pilot at that point, but I went to basic, which was at Lancaster, California. We flew BT-15s, sometimes BT-13s, and I got a wonderful instructor. My instructor was Mr. Chapman, Larry Chapman, and at War Eagle Field in Lancaster, and it was a basic flying training command, but it was one of the few that had civilian instructors. So I was very fortunate. He was very good, and when I left there, I was able to fly. The airplane that we flew at Lancaster in basic training was much advanced over our primary one. It did not have retractable gear, but it had a propeller which you had to change the pitch, and many other things that were much more powerful. And they were very noted for the problems they had in flat spins. War Eagle Field was really a nice air base. It had been an RAF training base before we went there. The flying there was very concentrated. In fact, it was concentrated all the way through because the Army Air Force couldn't wait too long to get pilots and airplanes. We did many different things than we had done in primary. We actually had two classes at the field at the same time. One would go 4.5 weeks or 5 weeks and leave, and another one would come in, because you had 9 weeks of basic. And there had one group of housing for that particular class, and then they had a different place which was right along the runway, and that's the one I got in. And when we started night flying, that was very noisy. And we did night flying, we did a little formation flying, but we did a lot of, and some cross country, but a lot of it was just plain learning to fly the airplane. And I think that by the time I left basic, I could fly. Now, we left basic and went to different advanced schools depending on where somebody classified you as to single engine or twin engine. I went to twin engine, not through any choice, because they put you in effect where they wanted to. Went to twin engine at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, where we flew AT-17s, which is also called the UC-78. And that base was the opposite of War Eagle Field. We had tar paper housing, and we did have a post office, so we got letters. In advanced, we did not fly with the instructor very much. In fact, I flew with 2 or 3 different lieutenants generally, or captains. They were military at advanced. And we would fly with 2 or 3 students in the airplane at the same time so that you could rotate and all of you get some pilot time, some co-pilot time, and some dead time just flying in the back. So anyway, that led to a lot of cross countries and a little bit of formation, but as I later learned, I didn't have nearly enough formation. Of course, we didn't have time to do it all. Fort Sumner, the AT-17, was a real nice airplane in my opinion. It was very easy to fly. Twin engine, you could lose an engine and still fly. We had the weekend, or at least Sunday, part of it off. I would go into town with another group of the cadets, and we would buy a watermelon and have a big day. That was our idea of a big day. The town of Fort Sumner really was not a large city. I graduated from Fort Sumner in advanced twin engine training on September 30th, got a discharge from the Army of the United States. The next day, on October 1st, I was an aviation cadet no longer, but I was a second lieutenant with wings, which was what we had been shooting for. Now we wanted to go out and end the war. Okay, now we're going to leave and take a 10-day leave and go to San Diego after the graduation at Fort Sumner. Then from there, my orders were to report to Santa Monica, where they had resort hotels prior to the war, and they had us billeted in there briefly. you got your orders from there, and I went from there to Salt Lake City. In Salt Lake City, I got to live in the horse barns at the state fairgrounds. And they were exactly not able to handle all the people that were coming in and going through their system. The people in charge there told us, newly commissioned officers, that they were sorry we'd have to make our own beds. And I don't really think that bothered me too much. Out of the Fort Sumner graduates, there were just 3 that went to Salt Lake. And the 3 of us went to Salt Lake and then to Boise. One of them was in the 8th Air Force in the group that was not too far from where we were in England. And he died in a crash, mid-air collision. So I was lucky. So from Salt Lake City, I was there a few days. From there, I was sent to Boise, Idaho. I got to Boise and was assigned to Crew 76, the last crew in the 458th Bomb Group Heavy. So that was the last crew in that group. So if I hadn't gotten on that one, I wouldn't have been in that group, and I would have been in who knows what group, which may have gone to Italy, very likely, or the 8th Air Force where I went, or even to the Pacific. So it was all sort of a matter of luck and the way the ball bounced. So I had one ride in a B-24 before we left Boise. So I was a real late comer onto the crew. They probably had more to worry about than I did, because they saw this 19 or 20-year-old guy coming onto their crew. Only one younger, or about the same age. In fact, he's still alive and I'm still alive, and we're the only 2. At Tonopah, we did a lot of formation, or some formation, and a lot of cross-country flying. We also took a trip out over the Pacific Ocean and looked at the Golden Gate Bridge. We also flew down into the Grand Canyon, looked that over. So we had a lot of interesting flying and getting used to the B-24, learning what to do with it and its eccentricities. So I had to learn all about handling 4 engines. What happens when you lose an engine, different than if you still have one going on that side, or if you lose them both, etc. So I had a lot of learning to do, which I did. Obviously, I got back. B-24 was a very hard ship to fly rudder-wise. It took 2 people on the rudders when you had real problems. Ailerons were not as sensitive as they were on some of the other bombers, one in particular, which we won't mention. And the 24, we shot landings, both of us. And then we did air-to-ground gunnery a day or 2. That was sort of interesting. The other pilot would go back to the waist and shoot, and then I'd go back in the waist and shoot. In our air-to-ground gunnery, we flew very low, and the targets were out on the side of the airplane, and the gunners got good practice shooting at the targets, and the 2 pilots also decided they'd like to, so they went and did it also. We also practiced bombing, dropped a few bombs. Obviously, in the short time you have to train, we didn't drop many bombs, we didn't fly much formation, We didn't do anything in the quantities that I'm sure they would have liked to have given us. When we finished our training at Tonopah, we were given orders to go to Hamilton Field, which is north of San Francisco, pick up a new airplane to fly it to wherever we were going, which we didn't know. Being on the West Coast, we kind of thought it would be to the Pacific. But anyway, when we leave Tonopah to go over to Hamilton Field, we had no problems. We got the airplane. And then we had to do some slow timing and some gasoline consumption measurements. So we came back into the valley here in the Sacramento area where I now live, and we flew up and down the valley for days. We flew the first time for gas consumption and was socked in Hamilton Field when we wanted to go back, so we landed at McClellan Field in Sacramento. Took off from there the next day, did it again, and again it was socked in, so we landed in Sacramento. The next day we took off from Sacramento, went to Hamilton Field, and landed okay. Now when we got ready we had all the paperwork and things had to be done as well on the airplane, the calibration of the compasses and things like that. The orders were to Palm Beach, Florida. We went to Palm Springs first, spent the night there. Then we went to Memphis. Well, we stopped in Midland, Texas before that. Then from Memphis, we went on to Palm Beach in Florida. We stayed there 3 days getting more paperwork done and getting the final things necessary to get the airplane going. After 3 days there, we headed out overseas, and we had orders which said open 1 hour after you take off. So we did that, and we took off, and we found out we were going to the 8th Air Force in England. Meanwhile, we were going the southern route. We didn't go the northern route, which would be a lot quicker, but there was too much problem with ice for B-24s. So therefore, we were on the southern route. We went from Palm Beach to Trinidad, the British West Indies, then to Belém, Brazil, then to Fortaleza, Brazil, then to Dakar, Africa, then to Marrakech, then to Valley, Wales, and then we were actually on our way. Then we went from Valley to Horsham, St. Faith. Now going back on this, there were some interesting stops. The stop in Dakar, in British West Indies was interesting. The one in Belém was extremely strange. I hope to never have anything like it again. It was raining so hard that we landed in a lake practically on the runway at Belém, Brazil. That was at the mouth of the Amazon River. From there on we went, and when we got to Dakar, we landed on a steel mat for the first time, and that will scare you, the noise it makes as your wheels hit. And I saw some of the biggest people I ever saw in my life, and they guarded our plane. We landed in Valley, Wales. We had come with Ireland on one side of us and England and Wales on the other, coming up the, whatever it was, the Wash. And they didn't want to fly over Ireland because they didn't like us at that time for some reason. We were told to stay away from Ireland. We called in and got emergency landing instructions, landed at Valley, Wales, and there we had a pot-bellied stove to keep warm. They're accommodations were not too great. And then we went from Valley Wales to Horsham, St. Faith, which was the closest air base to Norwich, the biggest city around in East Anglia. And that was where we started our adventure in combat. We flew 3 or 4 or 5 what they called practice missions, and 1 or 2 diversionary missions, and learned to fly formation in a hurry. Horsham St. Faith Airfield was number 1, 2, 3 in Air Force terminology, and it was extremely nice for the times. We were fortunate that it had been an RAF base in the past, and they had quarters of brick houses for the officers. So what we lived in, our crew, the 4 officers, had one or two rooms in this brick house, and another crew would have a couple of rooms and whatever it could take. So you'd have maybe 8 or 12 officers from 2 or 3 different crews housed in that particular building, and then there were others like it. The enlisted men were in a enlisted men's barracks, and it was completely different, different part of the base, just not for any particular reason, it just worked out that way. But we had, going from our housing to where we ate meals was across a dirt lot, and when it snowed and rained it was a mess, so we had to walk through mud and snow to get to our food. Now, as far as the rest of the combat missions, we flew until we had 30 missions, but taking them, we flew mostly into Germany, over what was enemy-occupied countries. Flew over the Zuider Zee a good part of the time, up at the North Sea some of the time. You didn't exactly want to go down in the North Sea because you wouldn't last long. Water was so cold. After our practice missions, we finally got around to first flight of any size that our group was in, and that was on March 6th, 1944. We were going to fly on that one, but one of the pilots had a cold, and therefore we were scrubbed for that day. It was a very fortunate thing that he had a cold, really, on a selfish point of view. We lost a number of planes on that mission. The 8th Air Force, I think, lost 60 airplanes. So we were on the ground on the 6th of March. And the 8th, there was another scheduled to Berlin. That one went to Berlin the 6th. The first Berlin deep mission. And then on the 8th, they went back there and we flew. And it was our first mission, and it was, I would say, very tough. And we learned to fly practically in the other airplane because you wanted to get all the guns you could focused on the German fighters. And the way you did it was to keep all of your airplanes in close together. Then one to Berlin being my first one, we really thought it was a tough road. We lost a couple at least. Then we stayed down for a day or two, and we went to the next mission, our second one, which went to Friedrichshafen, which was a long ways from where we were. It was right up next to Switzerland and the Swiss Lake Constance. So that was tough. We had lots of flak and lots of fighters. we made it back on that one, and the next one, our third mission was also to Frederikshavn, and it was just as tough. And the fourth one, we went back to Berlin. Flying out of Norwich at Horsham St. Faith, the flying conditions were absolutely horrible. We had fog constantly, we had rain, even snow, and when we get up to altitude, be about 60 degrees below zero. We had electric flying suits, which were very good, and then they were covered over by other items of clothing. Some wore sheepskin, leather pants and top jacket. If you were out in the back of a B-24 with it, it's cold enough in the cockpit where I was, but if you were in the back by the open windows, it was really cold. Everything was frozen. And you didn't dare touch any piece of metal if you took your gloves off. You had the linen gloves or something, cloth glove, and then the heavy leather gloves. And of course, the gunners, with their having to arm the machine guns, had to be very careful. We lost a lot of frostbite people on those missions. There weren't a lot of conveniences on the B-24 in combat at altitude. We had no toilet aboard. We had oxygen, which at 10,000 feet, we put the oxygen mask on and notify all the crew to put it on. And then when you got up altitude and it was freezing, everything was freezing. You had to keep cracking the ice in the oxygen mask with your hand, or it would freeze up solid, and then you'd be out of luck and out of oxygen. So the conveniences were not there. It was a very rough flight. You'd fly 8 or 10 hours and you were really tired. We were given a candy bar for each member of the crew when we took off. And by the time we got over into altitude, over the continent, which was at that time completely occupied by Germany, so we had no place to land. The candy bars by that time when we were up were frozen solid. So you got the candy generally to eat after you're coming back and let down a ways, so that it thawed out enough you could sink your teeth into it. I think they were Milky Way bars or Three Musketeers or something like that. At any rate, that was the extent of your energy-producing foods for the trip. One pilot would be on the intercom, and one pilot would be on the radio station, whatever you call it, so that they were hearing the leader, and we would alternate on that. We flew one mission, the only one, at a low altitude of 12,000 feet, which was into southern France, where they were training pilots. So we went in and bombed many poor cadets at that time. Those German pilots didn't know what hit them, or so-to-be pilots. The idea was to get the Luftwaffe inactive as far as active people and training them and the whole works, so that then the invasion was to come. You didn't have a Luftwaffe that was going to give them trouble. Some of the missions, we ran way short of gas, and we would have to land at the first field we would see, and that could be a fighter base of the RAF, which it was one time. And if you didn't run short of gas, why, you went to your home base, obviously. I think we'd landed at other bases 2 or 3 times, 4 times, and you would be landing on a short landing strip, about 3,500 feet, I think. And it was very difficult to get in, but it was even more difficult to get out the next morning. They always planted trees at the end of the runways. I don't know why, but that just was a habit they had. We would be flying and have ME-109s after us, FW-190s, and we had some support from our fighters. We had support from P-51s on our side and P-38s, P-47s. The trouble was that they couldn't carry enough gas to be with you all the way, and so they would have rendezvous points. And finally they got airplanes and wing tanks and things, which they did a better job. But it was good to have the U.S. fighters, because some of them you couldn't tell from the German fighters at a distance, but our gunners were always told to hold up and be sure they saw what they were shooting at. The 51 looked like the ME-109. The P-47, ours looked like the FW-190. So the gunners did have to make a pretty careful analysis of what they were shooting at. They come at you from the front high and about 5 abreast, and they usually got somebody. And they make a pass, they'd get a bomber usually. During the missions, of course, we had these enemy fighters trying to shoot us down, as well as Flak. Flak was very, very intense in many, many places. And we would see the Flak, it would come up and you could see like a big shell exploding, and it would show shrapnel in all directions. It was right on your airplane or in your bomb bay, you probably would go down. But it was very tough to fly through that. And over places like Berlin, it was just almost solid. They had it on the coast. For the coast, they had more aiming direct, and rather than the pattern of the whole sky being covered. When the Flak would go over, when you were going over like a city of Berlin, you had a heavy Flak. Their fighters would stay on the outside and not attack you during the Flak. Then as soon as you got rid of that Flak, got out of that area, the fighters would attack. So they had it down pretty good as to their method of Flak and fighter defense. We had a tremendous number of fighters attack us while I was over there, particularly the early part of my tour. And as we got more missions under our belt, they saw fewer fighters. And then after D-Day, which I'd flown my last 2 missions on D-Day, the fighters were just almost non-existent, although I'm sure if you were up there and a few of them hit you, you didn't think so, but they would talk about the men flying after D-Day about the Flak and not the fighters. And the fighters were, if they came through you, they would get somebody. The different types of missions we flew against railroad yards, aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, all kinds of things that affected the war effort. Our bombing was daylight bombing, and it was strategic bombing, whereas the RAF did night bombing, and that was more pattern bombing. Easter Sunday, April 9th, the ship that we had flown over, 432, was flown by Logie's crew, and we were not to fly, and then they decided it was an all-out effort So we flew in another plane, whereas he flew our plane, and he got shot down over Denmark. And it was an interesting story because the three of the crew members, the pilot, co-pilot, and radio operator, were back at our base within 3 weeks in civilian clothes that they had gotten in Sweden. The story on that particular mission goes on, but from after the war we heard from a Danish man that he had a piece of the, well, he had a piece of the propeller from that airplane. He was a boy growing up when near the area where it went down in Denmark. And he and his family communicated with us, and we got to know them. When the Danish man passed away, family was very nice. They gave it to us. They even had to build a box to send it in. And it got here in January of 2007. This is the propeller which we received from the Danish man. It's the propeller from the airplane 432 that we picked up at Hamilton Field and flew overseas. And it is heavy, and it's just one blade of a 3-blade propeller. So this is 1/3 of one set of power, the engine, and there had 4 of these, so there would be 12 of these on the airplane, on each B-24. During the missions, we had to find a convenient way to fly so that the 2 pilots didn't get any more tired than was necessary. The way we did, different crews did it different ways, but the way we did it is one of us would fly for about an hour, and if the one that was flying off of a wing, in other words, if we were on the wing that I could look out and see the plane closer, I'd fly for an hour, then he'd take it for 10 minutes, and then I'd take it and go back and forth. And if it were on the other wing, then the other pilot would fly, and I'd take it for 10 minutes in between, so that neither one of us would be completely worn out, although we were pretty much by the time we got back. But that was the way we handled that. This was also not only good for our not being worn out too much. We did not like to fly cross cockpit. In other words, I would fly when I could look out my window and fly. He would fly when he would. I didn't have to look across the cockpit to fly the airplane, and he didn't have to. So that was the way we worked it out, and it worked out real well. We stayed together the whole time, and I finished up on my missions on June the 6th, flying 2 missions. The other pilot finished his on June the 8th because he did not fly on on April 29th, and a mission which some of our crew flew in different places. They needed some spot people in the gunners on different crews and so on. During my stay in England, I was hungry most of the time, of course. At that point, I was 19 or 20 years old during that period. And I was hungry constantly, and so I would go into the town of Norwich, which wasn't too far away, and go to the Red Cross, the Officers' Red Cross Club, and the sandwiches that they were able to give us were tomato sandwiches. At night we would go into town, the crew, 4 officers generally, would be together, and we could smell the places where you could get food, the fish and chips, and they had a lot of those places, and we would find them, and I would always buy fish and chips when I went into town. Now, I did not go into town as much as most of them, so what would happen would be the crew would go in, the other 3 officers, if they went in, they'd bring home some fish and chips, wake me up, and I'd eat fish and chips in the middle of the night. The reason that we had to be able to smell them was that the blackout in England was so complete that it was absolutely dark. I mean, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. So it was very good that we could find out where the fish and chip places were by smell. On the mission to Mannheim, we were in a lot of flak, and they were very accurate. We took out a new airplane that day, and when we came back, we had over 300 holes in it. In addition, there was a 20-millimeter shell in the gas tank that didn't explode. So all in all, that airplane went to complete redo before it could ever fly again, if it ever flew again. But we were happy to get home. When we got back on the ground, the engineer, one of the engineer gunners, asked me a question, and I answered it by saying there'd been no atheists on board that plane. The airplanes were changing frequently, and minor things in them. We flew mostly H's, Model H and J of the B-24, and one time they put armor plate around and over the head of the two pilots and around the back and the sides. That was great if you got hit, but they didn't give you more than about 6 or 9 inches to get out between the seats. If you had a backpack on, it was difficult. And of course, we didn't have backpacks until a number of missions into the tour. We had what they called a chest pack, and that was what the rest of the crew had, because they couldn't wear a pack all the time on their back like we could where we were sitting. So if they were blown out of the plane, they were out of luck. If they jumped, they'd pick up their chute, hook it on the front, and go. They modified the airplanes as improvements were brought about, and they put armor plate on both sides of the two pilots. And luckily, one day one of the armor plate on my side had a big hole in it. So it was a good thing it was there. It stopped the bullet that would have been in my cockpit. When we went over, we flew a camouflaged plane, which was sort of a greenish color. And we had those for a number of missions, and then the silver planes started coming in. And obviously the silver planes could be turned out faster. They didn't have to put another coat on them. And they also, theoretically, would give you a faster stalling speed or a faster airspeed also, because you didn't have the friction from that rough camouflage paint. But when in flying the ones that were all silver, it was very difficult because we took off, flew to the east in the morning when the sun was there, flew to the west in the afternoon when the sun was there. So off of the silver airplanes, it was a real tough job because of the glare. On that mission on the 29th that I flew, the 8th Air Force was trying out a new system. They would put someone, a pilot's knowledge, in the tail turret. That was me. And he would talk to the lead command pilot, who would usually, in other words, you'd be in the lead ship as a command pilot there with some rank, and you'd inform him as to how the formation was coming from behind. In other words, you had to keep telling them, come up, close in. So that was one mission I flew on the 29th of April in the tail turret, and it was a rough mission. It was also to Berlin, and I certainly saw the war from a different angle. but I was so busy telling the others to close it up that I guess I didn't see any more than I would have from the front. Anyway, it was an interesting change. I don't think the 8th Air Force continued that practice more than a few weeks. On this mission, the gunners in the airplane I was flying in claimed 2 enemy fighters shot down. We had fighter attacks all the way out until we got to the coast and back home. Towards the end of our tour, which we could hope would end at 30 missions, and we would get there pretty soon, the powers that be decided that we shouldn't fly all of our missions real quick, but we'd be saved for get some experienced crews for D-Day. So we were given a 7-day leave, and we hadn't had one before, so it was all okay anyway. With 7-day leave, Nelson Stewart and myself went to Bournemouth, which was a stepping off point for the D-Day, the invasion. The only thing we didn't realize was that this was the embarkation point for troops, and there were troops in hundreds, tens of ships at any rate, and probably hundreds, right there along the coast. So as we were merrily walking down the street, the MPs picked us up and told us we shouldn't be on the street. So they took us into their headquarters, and we explained that we had done our fighting and we were here on a 7-day leave, and that we should be all right to be on the streets, even though they didn't want any military walking around that town. So they turned us loose, and off we went. We found a hotel to stay in, and it had an indoor swimming pool, and it was very nice and pleasant. The Crew 76 that I was on flew a number of airplanes at the time we were at Norwich. The reason being, we flew 432 across the ocean and over there, but then it got shot down, as I said earlier, and so we were without a plane. Then we got another new one later on, but meanwhile we had flown a lot of different airplanes. The new one we got was one we painted the alligator on it and called it Gator. We flew quite a few missions in that, but we also ended up flying 15 or so airplanes, and different airplanes in the combat. On June the 4th, we were scheduled to hit an airfield at Bourges, France, which we did, after which we were heading home, and we got information that our field was socked in and we couldn't land. So we landed at Kenley, which was just south of London, because the weather was decent, but we were still flying partial instruments, partial formation. It was just a very difficult time. So we took off the next day for Horsham, St. Faith. We got in and landed there, and this is on the 5th. And we ate and whatever, and we'd go to bed, and that was the night they woke us up at just about midnight for the invasion on the 6th. They told us it was D-Day. We ate breakfast probably around midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. We got out for a briefing, and of course it was sort of a great relief that the invasion had finally come. We were in the air while it was still dark on D-Day, of course, and there were so many airplanes flying around, and of course they didn't have a lot of lights on them, and you just see airplanes going in all directions, which of course wasn't what it was supposed to be. So the navigator on our crew and two pilots decided that we would go out over the North Sea to get away from this, come back in at the time we were supposed to be formed. So we made a trip out over the North Sea and got away from the chaos of all those airplanes. Came back in, and we think we were the first group that went over in the invasion. So we dropped our bombs behind the beachhead at about 6 o'clock, as I remember, before the invasion, before the landings started. And then we landed back at Norwich, Horsham, St. Faith, at which time the people, we were told by higher ups that we should stand ready to go out on another mission. So as it turned out, we flew a different airplane on our second mission on D-Day, but it was the third mission, the 8th Air Force on D-Day. We didn't fly the middle one. So we got some food, no sleep, and they gave us benzodrine tablets. So we were then moved over to the crew, got in the trucks and went over to the other airplane that we were scheduled to fly this mission in. We had had time to eat, and that was about all. And then we took off again for Avranches, which was a railroad junction behind the lines. They wanted to stop all the transportation from benefiting the Germans on the coast. So we went to Avranches, and on both of the missions, what little you could see through the clouds was just a solid mass of boats in the English Channel. We didn't get back until after dark again, so it was close to midnight when we got back. And again, there were a lot of airplanes in the air, but we had a very close call and almost had a mid-air collision coming into Horsham, St. Faith, but we didn't. That was my 30th mission, so I didn't have to fly anymore, although we were told that we'd have to be ready. That was a little bit disappointing in that I had hoped that I was finished, and now I didn't know whether I was or not. But Colonel Isbell would do his best to keep us from having to fly combat until we saw how the invasion was going. Obviously, it went okay because I did not fly anymore in combat. In combat, it was very common for crews to abort. That would be, they felt they could not make it to the target and back. They had mechanical difficulties or something. At least they'd better prove that they had something, because there was too much, there wasn't too much, but there were a lot of airplanes that aborted when it was questionable. I'm happy to say we never aborted. We were given a certificate signed by the general and the colonel saying that that was good. The certificate that we received from the colonel and the general, I'm very proud of, and I feel that that's just as big an honor as the Distinguished Flying Cross, which I received. While we were there and not flying combat after the June 6th invasion date, until I left England in July, we flew a formation ship for the group. The assembly ships were something that they came up with after we were flying combat, and it was a very good idea because this airplane was marked differently than all the others. Each group had their own markings. We had one with a lot of spots on it, and dots and different colors, and it was very clearly seen by the pilots trying to form for the formation and get ready to go across the channel. So that the formation ship was the one on which the entire group formed up on, and it took quite a while, particularly in that awful cloudy weather, foggy weather, and clouds up, layers of clouds up to 10, 20,000 feet. The formation ship would then leave the group, and the lead plane would take over, and the formation ship would go back and land at the airport. This is what we flew in a couple of times after we were waiting, after we finished our combat. We flew other things that necessary, miscellaneous type flying, slow timing engines and things like that. So that they kept us out of trouble and kept us busy, but then in July we were told we were finished. At that point I was sent back on orders to where I had landed in England, Valley, Wales. And Valley, Wales was a different base when I got there now. The Americans had been there, and it was now a very modern base. We didn't have the pot-bellied stove anymore, and we had heat. So from Valley, Wales, I was put onto an ATC flight to Presque Isle, Maine, which we landed in Presque Isle, Maine. I then had to get myself from there to home in San Diego. From Presque Isle, Maine, I got a military flight down into the United States lower sections to where I could get an airliner going to Los Angeles and then to San Diego. So I was in San Diego for a few days and leave, after which my orders had sent me to Santa Monica Redistribution Center, which was the same place I had been after I first was commissioned. The redistribution station in Santa Monica, which were these luxury hotels before the war, I said I was fine. So they sent me to Fort George Wright in Spokane, Washington, which was a get well center in effect or whatever. So I guess that maybe it didn't pay to talk about your problems, because those guys got shipped out immediately, and I went up to Fort George Wright in Washington, and it was a couple of months up there, and it was very, very nice. Just trying to get all of this out of my head, I guess. After a very pleasant month or two at Fort George Wright, I was sent back to Santa Monica Redistribution Center, and from there I was sent to Victorville, California, because they had airplanes that I checked out in to fly, supposedly. Got there and they had nothing but pilots. No, very few airplanes. They were AT-11s, which is a real nice airplane, twin engine, twin tail, all metal. So I got a couple of flights in those AT-11s and was there for some time, a month or so, and there's nothing there, so they then gave me orders to Pecos, Texas, to go through instructor school and become an instructor. Went to Pecos, Texas, and it was in the West Texas, which the wind blows, the sand blows. It is a very miserable place to live when you're not used to it. And it's also difficult because they had UC-78s, AT-17s, which I, of course, had flown, but they're a light airplane, and you get a good crosswind coming into land, and you think you're going to flip right over into the top of you. And the wind was just unbelievable. Anyway, I went through the instructor school, got the title of instructor, went to the engineering officer and said, I'd like to get into your department. He said, fine, and I became an assistant engineering officer and flight test pilot. So what I did for him was to fly 2 or 3 airplanes a day, whatever they had needed. I was flying when they changed engines or changed tires, changed wheels, any repairs, anything that was done to the airplane had to be taken out and flown and approved that it was ready for the instructor school. So I did that for a couple of months. It was very, very nice. I got a tremendous amount of flying in short spurts, and they didn't get as tired like in a 10-hour flight in England. So I was flying half hours at a time. Sometimes I'd have a flight in or a crew chief in with me, and sometimes I would be by myself. It was very leisurely type flying. So I also got the title of test pilot at that point, even though it was just always AT-17s. UC-78, the same thing. So after that at Pecos, what happened was the field closed down. It closed the instructor school, so all the officers had to go somewhere. So I was sent to Long Beach at the ATC, Air Transport Command. I was scheduled to renew my instrument rating, first of all, so I was checking out in C-47s with a man who was flying on the instrument part of my schedule. So I flew C-47s, MC-47s many, many times. Finished up getting my instrument rating renewed. And then I had to fly in B-25s to get ready to ferry A-26s and P-61s. So then I got a different instructor in B-25s. So I checked out in B-25s and finished that, and took quite a little while. Now I was scheduled to fly A-26s or P-61s. I checked out in the cockpit of both of them. Then a A-26 was there, so I flew an wasn't ready to be ferried anywhere, so I checked it out and checked an A-26 flying around Southern California, over San Diego, etc. And I got a few hours in A-26s, and then I was waiting for a P-61, and I'd still be waiting, I guess, because they quit making them and shipping them in there. So I had the cockpit check in the P-61, which was the night fighter, the Black Widow, I think it was called. And so I never did get a ride in that or get to fly it. So that was about the end of my flying career, was the A-26s. Few hours, not many. Then I sat and waited and see if nothing was happening. They sent me back to Santa Ana, where the whole thing had started. And I was waiting there in Santa Ana for a discharge, get out. And I was fortunate in that I didn't have to wait too long, and I was discharged for the second time. I was discharged originally when I got my commission one day and get commission the next day. Now I'm getting out, still in the reserve, and that's about the extent of the flying career of Bert A.
Bert Betts retired from the U.S. Army Air Force as a first lieutenant. For his valor, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and 5 Air Medals, in addition to a certificate of meritorious achievement for never aborting a combat mission. After his stint as a warrior, he quickly moved on, starting a family and becoming a certified public accountant. In 1959, he was elected Treasurer of California, the youngest ever California State Constitutional Officer. His many achievements include the Louisville Award, given by the Municipal Finance Officers Association of the United States and Canada as the most outstanding financial officer in those 2 nations, the only statewide officer to ever receive the award. He had 10 children, 19 grandchildren, and 9 great-grandchildren. He lived in Sacramento and Coronado, California with his wife of more than 50 years, Barbara Lang Betts.